It's interesting just to say, because it's to keep harking back to it, but the religion aspect, because it's so integral to it all. I mean, so for example, there's a there's that great 1970 film Cromwell with Richard Harris as Cromwell, isn't there, and Alec Guinness as Charles the First. In that, there's one bit in that which I think is really interesting, really telling. I grew up with that film, watched it loads and loads of times. There's one bit in that where, because Charles the First's wife was a Catholic, wasn't it? Henrietta Maria,
Yeah.
full blown practicing proselytizing Catholic as Queen of England, and the king needs to be very, very explicitly, staunchly Protestant. There's one bit in that film where they sit down to have a meal, and Charles I says to his wife, "Oh, I heard rumours that you let our son, i.e., Charles, later become Charles II, that you let our son sort of sit in on a Catholic mass this morning." And she says, "Oh, yeah, it's not a big deal, though, is it?" And him, for his character, sort of chides her and says, "Yeah, no, don't let that happen again, though. That's not on. I can't have that." So, but that speaks all sorts of volumes, doesn't it? It speaks volumes because one, he's just right, I suppose, but also it could sort of happen. Everything's a lot more informal or relaxed, shall we say. There's no sort of legal precedent saying that there would be any sort of inquiry if something like that would happen. It's all very up in the air, because when we get Charles II's wife, she's a Portuguese princess, isn't she, for the House of Braganza, um, um, and obviously and obviously James II, his younger brother, does reveal himself eventually to be fully a Catholic. And I've heard one, I'll let you speak in a sec. I just heard one more sort of anecdotal bit of evidence that whilst Charles II was still alive, apparently James had come to him and said, either I'm thinking of or I already have sort of secretly fully converted to Catholicism. And apparently Charles II was supposed to have not only not disowned him or anything, but sort of showed complete sympathy with that. And perhaps even, I think it's anecdotal evidence, but perhaps even said, yeah, he was considering something similar. And so just this interplay between Protestantism, or Anglicanism, and Rome, how integral it is to sort of what everyone's thinking and doing. It's easy to sort of, for us in a much less godly world that we live in, that it's just sort of an extra theme that sort of sits on top of everything, and sometimes important, sometimes isn't. But it seems to me it's really at the crux of nearly what everyone's saying and doing at most of the time. Again, am I overdoing that, in your opinion?
I would perhaps be a little bit skeptical of some of the historiography,
Okay.
if only because you need to get a little bit more into the mud of what the actual dynamics are with religion in England at the time, because you have three groups rather than just two. The Protestants are not unified in any
Yeah.
meaningful sense. You have the Anglicans on the one hand, who are the Tories are predominantly Anglican, and then you have the the Royalists before that. But the accusation against them is that they're always leaning more Catholic. But that was more of like a propagandistic smear, because one thing that both the non-denominational Protestants, who are more on the they almost all fall on the parliamentarian side, but I believe the parliamentarians are still majority Anglican. So if you follow me there, and then later they basically all flock to the Whigs and later the Radicals, and a lot of these guys are the same people who are off in America doing the greatest amount of rabble rousing against Britain and the Tories, as they would as they would term them, because one of their big concerns is individual liberties, because the biggest liberty that they are concerned about, the only one really, is liberty around their religion and how they want to practice their religion, because they are the ones who will be persecuted in practice. The Catholics are already gone; they're basically a non-entity at this point, since Elizabeth. But when you get to this kind of period, the one thing that both sides can agree on, both the parliamentarians later the Whigs and the Royalists later the Tories, is that they don't like Catholics.
Right. Yeah.
So anytime it's coming up that so and so is secretly a Catholic, it's potentially something that is meant to bring both of the major political wings on side to hate this one person.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, gosh, because as you say, there's three. I think the more the more you dive down into these things. It's nearly always the way in history, isn't it? The more you read about it, the more you know about it. Just the more infinitely complex the reality is. Because I mean, there's just lots and lots of different types of Protestant, aren't there? People that would call themselves Lutherans or Calvinists, or as I mentioned, the Anabaptist, or all sorts of different stripes of different degrees of Puritanism. And then you've just got the straight up Anglicans, strict Anglicans. Then the Scottish, you've got Covenantanists, all sorts of different things, right? But as you say, they would nearly all agree that the Pope is someone to rally around as a bad figure. Popishness is bad or evil, or like the stink of Rome
Yeah,
is
exactly.
that sort of thing. I mean, it's really quite strong to us, isn't it? That everyone agrees that we just don't want a Catholic monarch or Catholic government, certainly.
Well, yeah, I mean that extends up into the like mid 19th century, I believe.
Right, yeah.
Even as recently as the main one that comes to mind is the Gordon riots in the late 18th century during the process of the American Revolutionary War, where a group of very, very hardline Protestants, although I imagine most of them were Anglicans, I'm not entirely sure though, on basically the sense that there was going to be a relaxation of treatment towards Catholics, they start rioting and burning things down en masse in the capital. And it becomes such a scandal that any Catholic powers, of which there were a few that, I mean, even really just non-Protestant powers that England was trying to enlist to help them fight against the rebellious Americans, were turned off the idea. I believe the Spanish were sort of thinking about helping out the British and possibly also the Russians, but the Gordon riots really sort of turned them off the idea. And also, incidentally, for historical significance, this is also when you get the building of a proper internal security apparatus in Britain, because they basically get left wanting. They don't really have any proper police or internal or like organized internal security to actually shut down the riots when they happen. So that's the end of the sort of Whiggish optimism towards just letting everybody govern themselves. But it comes in handy when the French Revolution kicks off a few decades later.
It's funny, actually. I've got a quick example popped into my mind about how the British are suspicious of Catholicism. Even to this day, in the House of Lords, you've got Anglican bishops sitting there. There's no Catholic cardinals in the House of Lords, are there? I don't think you're allowed. Well, I'm pretty sure by law you're not allowed to be prime minister if you're a Catholic. Did you notice when Tony Blair left office, he converted? It's a weird thing to do, a man of his age, but he converted to Catholicism formally after he left office as prime minister. So I don't think you're allowed to. I don't think, even to this day, which is interesting to note. But yeah, the whole standing army thing, that's interesting. Charles II realised that we sort of need a permanent, after these many Dutch incursions, even very cheekily sailing up the Thames and bombarding London a bit, realised we needed some sort of permanent standing defences. It's funny that it's still the 17th century. That's quite late, is what I'm saying. That we're still in a position where we don't really have firm, permanent, completely permanent navy and army.
Well, I suspect he would have always wanted that, because it's a very useful tool in the arsenal of. Yeah, but it's very expensive, and there was a lot of opposition to him having it until there was an outright need for him to have it, and obviously that gave him somewhat more of the justification that he needed to be able to build it back up again. But the big thing at that point was the navy, so it caused him to put a lot more focus into building up the navy again to a much more competent standard, able to at least throw some punches at the Dutch more effectively.
I think it was in this age. Sorry to interrupt, just super quickly. I think it was in the reign of Charles II, right, where the Royal Navy went from competent to beginning to becoming sort of world dominant. Is it fair to say that it's during his reign that the numbers, just purely the numbers, if not the quality, sort of start skyrocketing?
Yes, I believe so. But it doesn't get fully confirmed, to my knowledge, until a bit later, because when the Netherlands are repeatedly demolished, essentially, due to their unfortunate circumstance of being, tied to France, mostly by overland, I should say. It causes multiple instances where they lose large chunks of their fleet, and are unable to protect themselves with it, because they're relying on an army that is fundamentally not able to punch on that same level.
Mm. Mm. I wonder what you thought of this idea. I'm speaking broadly again, but that the restoration of Charles II is obviously what it says on the tin is a restoration of the monarchy. But I've heard it also argued that it's really a win for Parliament as well, because they went from, let's say under the personal rule of Charles I, they went from nothing, I could argue, effectively, to, by the restoration, the sort of unquestionably the highest institution in the land. Executive power really does sit in their hands. And that it's not really questioned now after the restoration of Charles II. There'll be all sorts of wranglings for centuries more, but no one's really questioning that Parliament should be the highest body. And so they've have they not sort of cemented their position in lots of respects by restoring Charles II? It's sort of a win-win for the monarchy and Parliament. What do you think about that idea?
It helps the process, but I don't think it's set in stone until the Glorious Revolution in 1688.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Because, like I said, the monarch is still able to accrue more powers over that time. Charles II, and then later, much more briefly, James II is able to take more powers back into his personal control. And fundamentally, the army problem has still not been solved up until, I believe it is in 1688, when they, shortly afterwards, when they actually introduce the, what is it called, buying commissions. And the purpose of that is forgotten. It's now treated as something that was, purely corrupt and just a thing that had to be done away with in order to improve the quality of the army, to be able to promote on merit. But that's not actually the case. The original purpose of it was to, again, politically defang the army, because they wanted to make sure that people who were in positions of authority within the army were able, not were able, they were people who already had a significant enough investment in the domestic side of the country, within the civil life, to not want to join the king for some kind of coup. Because by having a certain amount of money, then you were established to a certain degree in civil life. Therefore, you wouldn't want to disrupt the whole thing. It's a similar idea to in Rome, but in reverse, because obviously in Rome you get the professionalization of the army away from being a landed levy sort of army, and so you get the gradual divorcing of the army from civil concerns, and the army is suddenly only concerned with who can pay them the most, which is obviously whoever can get ultimate power. They're trying to work that situation exactly in reverse until it's no longer required. By the time you get to the 19th century.
Right. It is interesting to see that how common it is. I'm talking throughout all of sort of human civilization here. How often it is that the leaders of an army sort of become conscious of their own power and will just subvert or murder the actual ruler or sovereign or king or whoever it is, chancellor, prime minister, whatever, president. The leaders of the army just realise that the ultimate power is actually who controls the officer corps of the army. And I do think it is interesting to note that, at least you're quite right to say James II doesn't count, but after the Glorious Revolution, let's say that Parliament, I mean, even to this day, nominally respect the Queen, or the King now, as their ruler, but they take direction from Parliament. It's Parliament who tells them you're going off to Afghanistan now, isn't it? It's not the Queen.
Well, I mean, in theory, it's like strictly constitutionally, all of the powers that are exercised by the government, other than being the head of the majority in the Commons, are powers that are royal but are lent to the government of the cabinet. So, in theory, the Charles III may be true to his namesake. It's not impossible.
Yeah. You see, it's an inauspicious name to take, isn't it, Charles? His predecessors, his namesakes, had very rocky times of it. If you enjoyed that interview with Rupert August, the whole interview is on lotuscetus.com, which is in a link in the description.